Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone to Sister Wives with Mary Jane K. Today it's book club, and I'll be giving my commentary on chapter 6 entitled Janelle from the Browns' memoir, Becoming Sister Wives. Janelle loved her new faith and her new lifestyle when she married Cody. She imagined Meri would become her new best friend just like a sister. She thought Cody would easily be able to navigate between herself and Meri. She believed in the fairy tale of happily ever after, so it left her unprepared for reality. Janelle lost her sense of self when she moved in with Cody and Meri. She never doubted Meri and Cody or her new faith or lifestyle, but she struggled to find her way. When Janelle was young, she lacked self-esteem. She struggled with her body image, and school wasn't her thing. As she grew up, she realized she valued working a great deal. Other than having her kids, Janelle valued her career most. It brought her security and happiness. Janelle was always happiest when devoting herself to work. She was determined to succeed at work and progress in her career. Especially after her first divorce, work gave Janelle inner strength and confidence. Janelle writes of her initial dynamic with Cody and Meri. After Cody and I returned from our honeymoon, I moved into the guest bedroom of his and Meri's house. In no time, I came to feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I felt like I'd barged not just into their house, but into their marriage. Meri and I went from cordial to frosty overnight. We sniped at each other over the smallest things. When she was younger, Meri had quite an overbearing personality. It was clear I was unable to do anything right, or rather, in a way that suited Meri. I folded Cody's clothes incorrectly, I bought the wrong dish soap, and I put away the dishes in the wrong places. I learned never, ever to fold Meri's laundry for her, but to leave it in the dryer long after the buzzer signaled that it was done. She made it clear I was disrupting her household. I was raised in a family that believed in keeping the water smooth. I'm a pleaser. I was raised to be non-confrontational. So I caved to Meri on all fronts. Many times I wanted to tell her off, give her a piece of my mind, but I just buttoned my lip and did things her way as best as I could. Of course, we know that Janelle and Meri have gone to counseling on the show, and they have tried painstakingly to improve their relationship. But even so, Janelle still doesn't trust Meri fully, as we know from the politicking Janelle did to try and ensure that Meri did not get the property on Coyote Pass with the drainage ditch, the so-called pond, because Janelle feared Meri limiting access to the kids and the family, or complaining about the noise or the traffic on her property, should she get the pond piece of land. We know that Meri had issues in the past allowing the family to pass through her apartment in the big house to access Christine's basement unit from the inside. Meri preferred everyone go up and down stairs and around through the outside every time, even in the wintertime. Janelle was so worried about the possibility of Meri limiting access or complaining should the pond be on her property that she even suggested they make it a private park area just to avoid Meri getting it. And Janelle tried to recruit Christine and Cody to her cause. We also know from the show, Janelle doesn't like to do cooking or cleanup with the other wives because she is self-conscious about those skills. And she used to be judged and called lazy, and that made her feel more inept. And we know Christine wasn't the wife berating Janelle, and Meri was the only other wife, and she tried to shame Janelle or accuse her of being lazy when she wasn't confident in those skills. And to then be shamed or called lazy makes you resist even wanting to attempt them. Meri also said she was overbearing herself, and she expected that if Janelle had issues with what they discussed, she would voice them. And Janelle would say nothing when they would have conversations, and she would tell Cody later to deal with it because she wanted to avoid the wrath of Meri. In my opinion, Janelle knew Meri would be hostile and it would be a futile effort, where regardless of what Janelle communicated, she would not be heard. It would just create hostility in Meri, and things would still be done Meri's way. And so triangulating Cody wasn't the healthiest move, but Janelle didn't have options to be heard other than going to Cody. And Meri resented that Janelle wouldn't communicate directly. But for Janelle, who likes things chill, Meri's energy and intensity and manner of communicating can be harsh and a lot. I think it also put a strain on Cody, who was having to communicate for Janelle. And it probably strained the marriages too between Cody and Meri and Cody and Janelle, because Meri probably didn't see how her behavior contributed to the dynamic. And she felt like Janelle was using Cody, and perhaps that Cody was siding with Janelle over her, when really Janelle was just trying to be heard. Janelle never felt the house was hers in any way. She stayed in her bedroom as much as possible. Cody, Meri, and Janelle were all young and new to plural marriage. The first year of plural marriage is typically difficult and tumultuous, and many plural families don't make it past that first year. The main problem for the Browns was all living under one roof. Janelle felt she did not get enough alone time with Cody. Cody didn't know how to act like Janelle's husband under Meri's roof. It's interesting that Janelle perceives this house as Meri's house, when Meri contradicts that in her chapter, when she says they moved into a new house when marrying Janelle, and Meri saw it as all of their house, not just her house. She also said she gave Janelle the master bedroom as a kind gesture, taking the small room in the back of the house instead, and that she didn't even know if Janelle appreciated it because Janelle wasn't very communicative. Janelle felt isolated, or like it was Meri's home, for example, when they would all watch a movie together and Cody and Meri would sit on the couch together and she was left out, so she isolated herself. Janelle physically distanced herself as much as possible in their small mobile home. She stayed away from the common areas and she kept to her room as much as possible. She set up her room as her living space. Cody was at his job from early morning to late at night, 6 days a week, and that added to Janelle's discomfort. Janelle would go to work, she would go to the family ranch and hang out, and then she would go home and head straight for her bedroom. Janelle spent a lot of time with her mom and Cody's dad at the family ranch. It was only 30 minutes away, and she threw herself into ranch life, spending as much time as possible there. She enjoyed working outdoors and the sense of identity it gave her outside of her family. It allowed her to clear her head and gain a sense of self. She also studied Native American arts and crafts and wild plant herbology. Janelle and Meri were stuck at home with their disagreements, often in the first years of their plural family. They rarely spoke to each other, but they tolerated each other. They were like roommates who didn't get along, but who managed to live together. It was uncomfortable and disheartening for Janelle. That celestial plural marriage was nothing like she imagined it would be. Janelle writes, "Often Cody would take Meri with him when he worked out of state, which made me very resentful of her. I couldn't just take off from work as she seemed to be able to, but when Meri didn't work, she didn't get paid." Janelle continues, "I thought it was extremely flaky to blow off work for fun like that, especially when we were so broke. Some of the family clucked their tongues when they saw Cody and Meri drive off on Sunday night after dinner at the ranch, leaving me to go home alone to our house in Powell. I was left at home in an unfamiliar small town in Wyoming, far away from most of the people I knew. This was the first time in my life I'd lived anywhere without many relatives or friends nearby. It was a terribly bleak time for me." In my opinion, and this is just my speculation based on opinion, part of the reason that Cody married Janelle was about her wanting to work and her being a primary breadwinner for the family. I do feel that Cody and Janelle had an intellectual connection. I don't doubt that. But practically speaking, Cody alone, who doesn't seem too ambitious, had to find a way to afford at least 3 wives to get to the appropriate place in heaven and to support a large family. Cody probably knew that he needed a career-driven wife to add to his income to make ends meet. We know Cody wasn't fond of working. He always had financial struggles. And Meri wasn't crazy about working either. In the book, Cody complains about not having the proper finances to absorb Robin, even later on, and so he prayed to God to fix it. And we also know that he was broke during his honeymoons for his wives, and all of his wives got road trips in the middle of nowhere, just thrown together, going to motels, visiting his parents' ranch. Janelle is more financially savvy, and she's the most practical, and she has a very strong work ethic and ambition. Her career fulfills her. I think this is very selfish of Cody and Meri. They knew Janelle wasn't able to join Cody on these one-on-one trips. She wasn't able to take off of work, and her income was needed to support the family. She couldn't just quit or take off whenever and not get paid. And when Meri took off from work, she wasn't contributing financially. So it was rude and careless and unfair and insensitive and selfish for Meri to join Cody and forego the income that the family desperately needed as well. Also, as far as things being fair across the board, how is that fair to Janelle when she did not get that time with Cody? So not only was Meri getting more one-on-one time with Cody, she didn't mind burdening Janelle further financially to cover when she didn't get paid. It feels like Cody and Meri took advantage of Janelle big time, and that they gained advantage from what Janelle contributed financially. It feels to me like Janelle was being used to some degree. It also was insensitive on an emotional level for Cody to be comfortable allowing his wife to feel isolated and alone while she was still struggling with her new lifestyle and marriage and polygamy. Cody didn't seem to provide a lot of emotional support for Janelle in taking on the marriage and the lifestyle, and because Janelle resented Meri and they avoided each other and had negative vibes, Cody taking Meri on these one-on-one trips, whether for his work or not, probably made Janelle feel that Meri received preferential treatment. Luckily, Janelle's mom was there for her, and they commiserated together as her mom was also going through her own adjustment period after marrying Wynn, Cody's dad. Both Janelle and her mom were new to polygamy, so they were unsure how it should go. Janelle says, adjusting to marriage is all-encompassing. Your worldview and awareness go through an upheaval, so you don't worry about what goes on in the outside world. Janelle had to work on readjusting her parameters and shifting her perspectives. So at the time, she didn't see the parallels with her mom's experience with plural marriage with Cody's dad. They experienced the same personal and emotional struggles, but they didn't discuss their struggles together. They just supported each other. They were supportive of each other, but they never really discussed the depths of their conversions into plural marriage together. Janelle was comforted in knowing that her mom was within driving distance, because when she moved from Utah to Powell, Wyoming to marry Cody, she didn't just lose most of her friends and family, she alienated most of them by accepting polygamy. Janelle's sister and her husband tried to intervene and bring Janelle back into the LDS, the mainstream Mormon church. Janelle was raised in the LDS, and the LDS frown upon the FLDS because they don't believe in the practice of plural marriage. It's considered a sin. Even though a lot of the core religion is similar, to my knowledge, the main difference is the LDS doesn't condone polygamy. It's a sin, while the FLDS is centered around living the polygamous lifestyle. Other family members had an intervention to try and reconvert Janelle back to the LDS. They viewed it as saving Janelle's soul. When Janelle was 8 months pregnant with Logan, she and Christine and Cody went to Salt Lake, and Janelle visited some of her family. Cody and Christine dropped her off at her relative's house, and Janelle had no car, so she was stuck. Couldn't she call a cab? I know there wasn't Uber back then, but if she wasn't comfortable, couldn't she just walk out and call a yellow cab or a taxi or take a bus or something? Her family knew that she was a captive audience till Cody returned. So they cornered Janelle in the living room and they hurled Mormon scripture at her. They told Janelle what she was doing, living with Cody, was wrong, and they didn't recognize Janelle as being married to Cody whatsoever, even in the spiritual sense. They told Janelle she was giving up her blessings, and she was furious and hurt. If you love your pregnant family member who is 8 months pregnant, why would you distress them and stress them out? All of that energy will go to the baby. So if they truly love Janelle, why do this in such a distressing manner while with child? It seems counterintuitive to what you do for a loved one, whether you agree with their choices in life or not. There's nothing worth stressing out a pregnant woman over, adding to emotional distress that they don't need. I don't get that. If God exists, would he want people cornering a pregnant woman, shouting scripture at her, telling her she will go to hell and waste her blessings, while she is close to giving birth and her body and emotions are going through so much? Why put her in a stressed mental state? Would God want you to argue which religion is right if it distresses the woman that's carrying a life? They don't like Janelle's religion, fine. They don't accept her marriage, fine. But is being righteous and trying to make this person go back to your faith because you believe it's right and she will go to hell otherwise, is upsetting her emotionally and spiritually while her body is stressed in the name of God, in the name of righteousness, appropriate? Is this what God would want? What if Janelle got so upset and so affected by this that her blood pressure rose and her stress levels went crazy and her chemistry changed and it affected the baby and she was in distress? Why not be pleasant and loving and discuss the religious stuff when she isn't growing a person inside of her who will be affected by the negative vibes? It seems very fucked up and inappropriate to me, in my opinion. Janelle disengaged herself from the family and she told them off and ran upstairs to hide in a room to wait for Cody to return. How would these family members feel if, God forbid, Janelle got so upset it affected her pregnancy? She was obviously upset. Janelle stays calm. She doesn't get too emotional or worked up. So for Janelle to run upstairs till Cody arrived, that means it was really toxic and abusive and very upsetting for her to feel that she had to hide away from the family till Cody got there. Many of Janelle's relatives, like her maternal grandfather, never talked to Janelle again, and they never forgave her. It's Janelle's personal choice what she does with her life, and it's not appropriate to not love your family member if they believe differently than you. That's not godly, in my opinion, and it definitely isn't right. They are still your blood and your family, and just because they live differently than you, that is no excuse to shun them and not accept them or love them all the same. And then to push your religion on them as if it's right above theirs. No one really knows who is right. Maybe all of the religions are right. If God exists, I really don't think that he or she cares what you follow or if you follow anything, as long as you do your best to do right and do good and live by your conscience. So, to disconnect from your family because you don't believe what they believe and to shun your family member because you don't believe what they believe doesn't make sense. It seems farther from good and farther from what people would consider to be godly. Everyone should believe in whatever they like, but it's not okay to assume your way is the only right way. Because in the end, whatever it is you believe, I highly doubt it's the only right way. I doubt it's even about what faith you're into, if you're about faith at all. It's about your conscience and the way you are and how your heart is and how your soul is. It's not about what church you go to or what temple you go to or what mosque you go to. And I understand that the LDS believes strongly that you go to hell if you practice polygamy or any other faith. And it's all very real and literal for believers of that. But even if you believe your family member is going to hell, wouldn't you accept them and have love and compassion? Would Jesus have berated Janelle for what she believed and shunned her? I'm not into any organized religion at all. But I do know that supposedly Jesus would chill with his disciples just as he would chill with the whores and the lepers and the downtrodden. So even if these people in Janelle's family believed she was headed to hell, is it appropriate to disturb a pregnant lady and try and shame her? Or should you just accept her as she is and love her just as you did before her lifestyle choices? People fight and fuss and argue and take land and they fight wars and they spill blood, all in the name of God, a supernatural, all-knowing entity, all in the name of which team, which religion is right, when no one really knows. You can have faith and believe, but it's not cool or acceptable in my book to judge others assuming your faith is the only right one to get into heaven, and that it's okay to alienate people and treat them as if they are wrong or bad or headed for hell because they don't believe like you do. It's very arrogant and it's very cruel, and in my opinion, it's just wrong. And what was done to Janelle is something very fucked up. Janelle rebuilt some of those broken relationships. It hurt her a lot losing those relationships. She felt shunned. You know, whatever religion you are, if you think your faith is the only one where those souls go to heaven, that's nuts. Does it sound plausible that if God exists and heaven and hell exists, that anyone who isn't of your exact faith belongs in hell, should go to hell, no matter what kind of a person they are? That doesn't sound plausible to me. I'm not trying to offend anyone. Not everyone will agree with me, and that's perfectly fine. But cornering a pregnant woman to the point where she has to hide in a bedroom is emotional abuse, and it was done in the name of God when it's a very cruel thing that could actually have affected her pregnancy, especially being exposed to toxicity and negativity and stress from the people who are supposed to love her, all in the name of God, when that seems like the opposite of what God would want if God exists. Janelle would normally turn to work as her outlet, but when Janelle married Cody, she had to quit her job in Utah to move to Wyoming, to a small town with few employment opportunities. She found a job, but it wasn't in line with her career goals. 6 months into her marriage, Janelle got pregnant with Logan, and Janelle was thrilled. She had something that made her feel like an important member of the Brown family. Janelle still hadn't figured out who she was or how she fit into the family, but she was proud to bring the first child into the Brown family. Janelle knew it would be uncomfortable telling Meri that she was pregnant. Meri was unable to conceive after 3 years of marriage, and she desperately wanted kids. Janelle is honest here. She says she didn't care how Meri felt about her news. Things were hard in Janelle's relationship with Meri, so she didn't care about Meri's feelings. I know that could be portrayed as cruel or insensitive to Meri, considering her struggles with fertility and her wanting kids so much and trying for so long. But we have to remember, too, that Meri was very hostile with Janelle, and she was very overbearing. And she made Janelle feel like an outsider and an unwanted house guest. And Cody and Meri would go off, and Cody did nothing to stabilize the dynamic. And he was young and dumb. And he didn't work hard to make sure Janelle was included in the family upon her marriage. It almost feels like Cody and Meri carried on like a monogamous couple, with Janelle there, married to Cody, holed up in her room, avoiding Meri like the bubonic plague. She would see Cody on her nights and avoid common areas. There was so much resentment and bad blood. So seeing this from Janelle's perspective, even though it appears insensitive, if you resent a person, it's very hard to care how they feel, knowing that they also don't regard you. I appreciate Janelle's candor. I'm sure it was very difficult for Meri, being Cody's first wife, and trying so hard for years, expecting that she and Cody would have the first child. And then to have Janelle come in and after half a year be pregnant with Cody's first child, that's very tough emotionally to deal with, I'm sure. And I'm not discounting that. Cody was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a father, but the happiness Janelle and Cody shared did little to smooth over the tension in the household coming from the dynamic with Meri. During Janelle's pregnancy, Janelle's relationship with Meri worsened, and the dynamic was at an all-time low. I'm sure the bitterness and resentment ate at Meri, and it was hard for her to be happy and view this child as a joy and a blessing. Janelle's pregnancy made her sick. She felt weak and physically exhausted, and Meri made constant jabs and snide remarks at her that Janelle didn't have the tolerance for in her state. Meri never overtly made Janelle feel unwelcome, but Janelle tried to stay in her room. She felt disenfranchised, even though she was carrying Cody's child. While Janelle was pregnant and sick and physically exhausted, and her hormones were all over the place, Cody went away on work trips, taking Meri, leaving Janelle alone. Janelle writes of one experience: just before one of those trips, when I was being left behind once more, my pregnancy hormones were making me feel especially vulnerable. Cody had taken a new job logging on a mountain, and I was upset to learn that he was again taking Meri with him. Meri took advantage of the situation to be exceptionally brutal. One of my friends and I had experimented with my makeup. As I was crying that I was being left behind, Meri began to ridicule the makeup I was wearing. This was the final straw after all the passive-aggressive behavior and snide remarks I had been dealing with for so many months. I completely lost it. I felt as if I was on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. Cody was on his way out the door when I stopped him. There were tears running down my face. I just need to know that you love me, I said. A strange expression spread across Cody's face. I felt as if he was going to laugh, not out of cruelty, but out of relief. Of course I love you, he said. That's all I needed to hear, I told him. That's it, Cody said. That's all I needed to say. I managed to nod through my tears. The smallest things make the greatest difference. But we were also young and we had taken on so much. Cody had a lot of learning to do. He was still a naive 25-year-old. His father, his mother, Meri's parents, and my mom were giving him advice from all sides. But ultimately, Cody would have to listen to himself and to his wives to achieve his own emotional maturity and understanding. In my opinion, Meri seems to have the capacity to be mean-spirited when she feels resentful. Janelle may have resented Meri, but she didn't say anything cruel or go out of her way to express her resentment with cruel words. She kept to herself in her room to avoid Meri, and Meri seems to enjoy going out of her way to be cruel if she is resentful. Pregnant women have their hormones and emotions all over the place, and their body is going through a lot. So to belittle someone in that state and to be mean on purpose because it makes you feel better, it shows that that person that's doing the cruel behavior feeds on negative energy. That person is operating from ego, and it also shows the person's character as well. Just because Meri is disappointed that she wasn't able to have the first child in the family or she wasn't able to have her dream, it doesn't give her the right to take that out on Janelle. It's a very childish mentality and a selfish way of being. I also think it's incredibly cruel of Cody to marry Janelle and utilize her financially while Meri is able to take off whenever she wants and forgo her paycheck to travel with Cody, as Janelle slaves away and her income is needed to support herself, Cody, and Meri as well. Without Janelle's income, Meri couldn't decide to work whenever she wanted and go on the road with Cody. It's very selfish and unfair. It feels to me like Janelle is being used by both Cody and Meri. For Cody to leave his new wife, his pregnant wife, who is still adjusting to the move, to her new job, to her new life, to a new place, everything that she adjusted for him, everything she's having to adjust to, everything she's having to sacrifice, it's completely ridiculous of Cody to take Meri and leave Janelle behind. I don't see how he could not find a job that kept him in one place, or how it was fair if he must travel for work to invite Meri to join him, knowing Janelle was alone and isolated and pregnant. As it is, Janelle would hole up in her bedroom to avoid the terror of Meri at that time, and Cody, as the husband, should have stepped in and worked with Meri to adjust better to Janelle. He and Meri should have adjusted their way of life to include Janelle, and their relationship had to shift. They were no longer living in monogamy. And to me, it feels like they married Janelle to be their financial backbone, and they kept living like a monogamous couple other than Cody going to Janelle's room every other night or whatever their schedule was. Cody should have worked to make sure he could juggle both Janelle and Meri and be equally available to both of them. And he should have been there physically and emotionally for Janelle if he was really in it for Janelle and all into their relationship. How could he accept Meri allowing Janelle to feel so unsafe? That she would hole up in her bedroom to avoid Meri, or that she would go to work or her dad's ranch to avoid going home. How did Cody not get involved and request that Meri treat Janelle as part of the family? Instead, he and Meri lived as they had been, and they added Janelle without really fully incorporating her or making the adjustments needed to absorb her into the family. And that is very unfair to Janelle, and I think she was used financially to some degree. Janelle was not able to take off of work, and Meri was willing to forego her paycheck and let Janelle cover the difference to travel with Cody. And Cody didn't seem to consider Janelle or having her back at all. It's sad to me that Janelle had to go to Cody in tears to get validation that he loved her, and he wasn't going to her and speaking to Meri and comforting Janelle. Janelle had to go to Cody, and he wasn't already there being supportive or possibly talking to Meri about her behavior. Janelle had to ask Cody to be validated that he loves her. She had to go to him in tears to ask, "Do you love me?" Because if Cody loves her, it makes the torment worth it. The torment from Meri at that time, the torment of her unaccepting family and friends. Janelle was very alone, and she had her mom, but she lost a lot. And this was a time where Cody could have put his foot down with Meri regarding her behavior with Janelle. And he could have been fair and more supportive of Janelle. And he could have considered how he and Meri cannot live like monogamists and incorporate Janelle to feel like an equal partner as well. He could have talked to Meri about them needing to adjust. And he could have made sure that he was fair with both Meri and Janelle, and that he rallied behind Janelle, who sacrificed a lot to be with him. When Cody noticed that Janelle lives her whole life from her bedroom, avoiding the common areas to avoid Meri in her own home, he should have been able to see how unfair and problematic that was. He should have sat with Meri and made it clear that Janelle has to feel welcome and wanted and accepted, and there can't be any bullying or toxic remarks or passive aggressiveness towards Janelle. And it's cruel to make a person so uncomfortable in their own home that they feel they have to live in their bedroom. If Cody was truly a leader, he would have done the hard work to incorporate Janelle. Being young and naive at 25 isn't an excuse. Anyone with common sense would step in and address it. It's interesting that even Cody's parents gave him advice, seeing the red flags, and Cody ignored it. It's also interesting that Janelle says Cody would have to listen to himself and his wives to achieve his own emotional maturity and understanding that he has now. When Cody now says things like, "My family is an obstacle to my goals in life. My wives are obstacles to my goals in life." He didn't have any emotional awareness or understanding then, and I don't think he does now either. I think Cody likes to skate by and avoid dealing with any of the issues within the dynamics, and he will bury his head in the sand and do what is convenient for him to avoid having to do what he should, in my opinion. Before Janelle gave birth to Logan, Cody began courting Christine and he married her. Janelle was so committed to plural marriage that she wasn't jealous. She was excited to have a wife in the family besides Meri. She knew having Christine in the family would take Meri's focus off of her and get her out of Meri's line of fire. Janelle was so tied up with her pregnancy that she didn't have time to worry about her new sister wife, Christine, during the courtship. Janelle didn't know Christine as well as Meri did, but she thought Christine was sweet and nice, but naive. Christine made it clear she didn't just want Cody, she wanted the whole family too, and the sister wives. Janelle felt Christine would be a good fit for the family, and she suspected that she and Christine would be closer than she and Meri were. Christine joined the family a few months before Logan was born. Janelle and Christine had slight differences, but it was nothing major. Initially, Christine was perceived as a little princess. Janelle was baffled by the fact that Christine felt she didn't need to work or have an income to contribute to the family. Janelle says over the years, Christine has become the cornerstone of the household stability, and she puts everyone first and she sacrifices working tirelessly for the family. But back then, Christine had little experience living away from her parents, so she was clueless about practical things, and that irritated Janelle at first. Despite the minor issues, Christine was a boon to the family. Overnight, the atmosphere of the house changed. Christine diverted Meri's focus from Janelle, and tensions floated away. Christine grew up in polygamy, so she knew about the ups and downs. She was cheerful and energetic, and she saw the world through rose-colored glasses. Christine's cheerful attitude was the perfect cure for the sour environment in the house. Cody likes to say Christine saved their bacon. After a few months, Christine and Meri developed a camaraderie, and Meri forgot her grievances against Janelle. Janelle took care of Logan and continued working as well. A few months after Christine and Cody got married, Christine got her own apartment, as Janelle still lived in the house like a roommate, although Meri diverted her energy, both positive and negative, to Christine. Christine and Meri had a history together, and Janelle and Christine didn't. After Christine and Meri were able to get past the initial jealousy that crops up at the start of every plural marriage, they spent lots of time together. Janelle says Christine and Meri had a friendship that she was not a part of at first. Janelle felt purposefully excluded from the friendship between Christine and Meri. Janelle admits she has always been sensitive to being excluded. Janelle had a baby to care for, and she knew that when Christine and Meri hung out and they did stuff, she couldn't go anyway. But Janelle was upset that she wasn't at least being invited or included at all. Janelle says groups of 3 women are difficult, and one person will inevitably feel like the shortchanged third wheel, even if it's all imaginary in your mind. And Janelle felt like the shortchanged party. Once Meri and Christine became good friends, Meri was less difficult to get along with. Life became more peaceful, and Janelle got a government job she enjoyed. Janelle and Cody still didn't have a conventional marriage based on a romantic love, but they still had a highly functional relationship. This is Janelle's husband, Cody, and the father of her kids. Shouldn't she hope for more than classifying her bond with Cody, her husband, as a highly functional relationship? Janelle says she and Cody communicated well and they complemented each other intellectually. I don't know that they communicated well. If she and Cody communicated well, wouldn't Cody be more understanding and supportive of Janelle, and wouldn't he understand her needs more? Christine and Meri had their first kids not long after Janelle had Logan. Christine had Aspen and Meri had Mariah. Mariah did announce that they want to be called Leo and their pronouns are they and them. So from time to time, I might refer to Mariah as Mariah to avoid confusion. But I will do my best whenever I can to refer to Mariah as Leo. I want to be respectful, but I also understand if I say when Meri had Leo for people who don't know the news that could be confusing. The wives had a greater sense of camaraderie as they raised the kids together. Becoming parents as one family became the most essential part of their lives and the most defining trait of their family life. Janelle thinks when Meri and Christine had their kids, they understood Janelle more. They understood her better. Before they had kids, Meri and Christine struggled to understand why Janelle was tired most of the time from tending to Logan. They didn't understand Janelle's priorities after she became a mom, and they felt she complained too much over trivial things. Janelle would complain that she had no time to shower or wash dishes or run errands. But once Meri and Christine had kids, they understood the challenges of motherhood and that having a child can complicate the simplest of things. Once they understood what Janelle was going through, they were much more willing to help out. Meri, Christine, and Janelle were able to lean on each other to get things done. Mostly, Christine, Meri, and Janelle were able to set aside their issues to raise the kids in a warm and stable environment. All of the kids were raised as one family. The kids may have different bio moms, but they think of themselves as full siblings, and they were raised that way. Janelle loved co-parenting the kids with Meri and Christine. She worked, and Christine and Meri homeschooled the kids, who did not attend the church school. While Janelle worked, she knew her kids were receiving the education and care that she wanted them to have, and she felt secure about her kids being tended to. Janelle trusted both Meri and Christine to care for her kids and to make parental decisions in her absence. Logan was a daredevil when he was younger, and there was an incident where Meri put some hot syrup in a pitcher on the counter out of reach of the kids. But Logan stacked chairs and objects to climb up, and the pitcher was so heavy it spilled on his scalp, and Logan was scalded. Meri handled it immediately, and she knew what to do to minimize the burn. And when Janelle got home, Logan just had a small scar on his face. Now, I know kids have accidents and you can't watch them 24/7 every second of the day. Sometimes for a second you look away to another child and something happens. Accidents happen all the time. But how did Logan manage to stack things, stack chairs or boxes to reach the counter with no one noticing any of the action going on before he even managed to get up on that counter to get his hands on the syrup? I know accidents happen, but it would take time and it would make noise to stack chairs or boxes to climb to get to the counter, to get to the syrup. So how could Meri not notice? How could Christine not notice all of the commotion of Logan getting things and stacking them as a toddler? If that happened on a babysitter's watch or at a child care provider, would you feel comfortable to keep your child there when you know the story that the child had to stack items to climb and climb them to get up to get to the hot syrup, and no one heard any of that process or saw it? Wouldn't you question the level of supervision at that place? Accidents happen all of the time, but it takes time, in my opinion, to find things to be able to stack from the floor to the counter to climb up. And Janelle does say that he stacked things to be able to get up there. So he had to stack things from the floor to the counter to climb them up. So wouldn't someone notice that commotion of Logan stacking things in order to climb? Janelle writes, when you have as many kids as we do, these small traumas are not at all uncommon. Most of the time when one of my kids got injured, I wouldn't find out about it until I got home from the office. By then, everything would have been taken care of by one of my sister wives. Whichever child had been hurt would be soothed, and the accident was already a fading memory. And again, I am not accusing, I don't think neglect was involved at all. Accidents happen all the time. You can be the best helicopter parent in the world and accidents happen. But just how are there two adults there and like 3 kids and no one noticed that Logan was stacking things in the kitchen? That must have taken time for him to stack them and then to climb them to even get to the syrup. So it boggles my mind that no one noticed that. Because it wasn't just a quick thing to just stack things up. He had to climb, get the things, stack them, climb them to get to the syrup, and no one noticed at all. That's it. But accidents still do happen, and this is still an accident. I'm not saying that Christine or Meri are at fault at all. That's not what I'm saying. I just want to clarify. Janelle says, 5 years into our marriage with Cody began maturing emotionally. He started taking charge of his decisions. When Cody was new to polygamy, he sought out the advice of the council of elders who had grown up in the faith, who had their own polygamous families. He often turned to Meri's family for guidance. Learning from those familiar with the faith and the lifestyle was crucial to Cody's development. But Janelle says, no two families or family situations are alike. Cody stopped relying on the guidance of others, and he instead relied on his heart, and his emotional maturity began to show. What emotional maturity? The man is 50 plus. He can't have an open, honest communication with his son, who desperately tried to communicate with his dad like a mature adult wanting a better relationship with him. Cody gave his son nothing back during that scene, and instead he reacted from a place of ego with no self-awareness. This season, when Cody was frustrated that he would not get his way, he said his family was an obstacle to his goals in life. He tried to manipulate Christine by removing sex from their marriage to try and adapt her behavior with Robin. He tried to tell his kid she should fly alone to do a surgery that is life-threatening when she was barely 18 in severe pain. And he suggested she fly across the country to do this major surgery during a pandemic by herself because it inconvenienced Cody. And Isabel was frightened that she would have to go alone. And her mom had to reassure her that she would be there with her. She would be going with her. She would never be going alone. Cody tried to discourage his daughter from the necessary surgery by saying she would be left with an ugly scar when it was a necessary surgery, and his daughter was also in a lot of pain. Cody also asked his daughter if him not going to the surgery would mean that she would become a bitter old housewife. That's the level of this man's emotional maturity at 50 plus. So how much emotional maturity and intelligence does this 50-year-old man have? He has this level now We can only imagine where it was when he was 25, if this is the place he's at now. Janelle says, once Cody took responsibility and he matured so much, making decisions from his heart, he asserted what he wanted rather than doing what others told him he should do and doing what other people told him he should want. Janelle says, Cody became a stronger leader in the household. He developed the confidence to take charge. Janelle writes of Cody, while he still had a lot of responsibility with 3 wives and many little kids, he had grown into a profound sensitivity and consideration, the likes of which I've never seen in any other man. I guess having 3 wives and many children taught him how to communicate with us in clear and loving ways, and he discovered how to devote himself to each of his marriages. He burst out of the fog in which he'd been wandering during those first tumultuous years, and he became the most sensitive and caring husband and parent I could have thought possible. Without his maturation, our lives as one cohesive and coherent family would never have become what they are today. Although Cody had matured significantly and was no longer the naive, spontaneous romantic with such a large family, we still had trouble making ends meet. For much of the first decade of my marriage, I lived with either Meri or Steen. Our house was crowded, and paying the bills was always a challenge. We never had enough money, no matter how hard we worked. This was the main point of contention in any argument I had with Cody. That, and we were practically on top of one another in our small house. There wasn't any room to breathe or think. Does Cody communicate clearly and lovingly? Again, how did he handle speaking to Isabel about her surgery? Even when mentioning the trip to New Jersey that Christine and her kids would take, Cody was intentionally an asshole, and he referred to that trip as Christine's vacation, when it was a needed trip for a necessary, serious, major surgery, as his daughter was in pain. What about with Gabe, when Gabe complained his dad no longer even called him anymore and he wanted a relationship with his dad? Is Cody a sensitive man? Is he sensitive to what others need from him? What about what his wives need from him? Does Cody go the extra mile to be the best husband he can to each of his wives? Or does he bitch and whine that his wives and family are obstacles to his goals in life? Calling your family your obstacle to your goals, is that loving? Is that sensitive? Is that the way the leader of a cohesive family with emotional maturity behaves? Manipulating, lamenting his loss of authority over his wives, throwing petulant fits, taking his resentment out on his kids, disassociating and pulling back communication if he feels his ego isn't fed, and if he is confronted with constructive criticism. Did Cody become the most sensitive and caring husband and parent Janelle could have thought possible? Is that how Janelle feels today? Cody doesn't speak to the older kids. He blames them for their resentment that was caused by his behavior and ego, saying they need therapy, the last tell-all. Cody said last tell-all that he and Janelle were not in sync with each other. And when Cody was asked if he was in love with Janelle, he asked the host to ask Janelle, because Janelle will say she isn't in love with him. Cody deflected. When Janelle was asked about Cody, she called Cody her best friend. Currently, Cody and Janelle aren't even reading the same book, let alone being on the same page. So is Cody the most caring and sensitive husband and father? Also, Janelle mentions many times she was so uncomfortable in their first house with Meri, she had to live from her bedroom and avoid common areas. Yet when Cody married Christine, she got the separate apartment, and Janelle was the primary breadwinner, paying for a lot of the family's needs from her job. The family struggled from the start financially, but Cody was able to get Christine an apartment of her own, and he allowed Janelle to live where she was incredibly uncomfortable, while she probably had to contribute financially to Christine's apartment, and Cody would travel for work and take Meri with him when he was away, and Meri would take off of work and not get paid. So when Meri was off with Cody, she would not get paid. So she wouldn't be contributing financially for all of that missed work. And Janelle didn't have the luxury to take off of work while pregnant. How is this fair for Janelle? Still, Janelle is working to pay for a lot of the finances while living in a house she isn't comfortable with. I wonder if she was given her own space, would she have felt more breathing room, and it might have strained her less to have her own space. So why was Christine given that apartment and not Janelle, who could have used the space? Why was Christine given that privilege, and a privilege Janelle probably had to contribute to financially, when she could have used that time and space with Cody? Christine and Meri got along better than Janelle and Meri did. It doesn't seem fair to Janelle. Janelle wants to work. Her contribution to the family is financial. She doesn't do the homemaking or the cooking or the chores or the homeschooling, and she likes working. And I think this is why polygamy works for Janelle, because there are sister wives to do the stuff that isn't Janelle's forte, and she can still have kids and have what fulfills her, her work, and contribute. But I also feel that Cody did marry Janelle out of convenience for financial reasons to some extent. And maybe initially Christine got that apartment because of her status in the church. I don't know, but even though income is Janelle's contribution and she thrives with the setup of polygamy for herself, I still don't think it's fair that Janelle was taken advantage of to make ends meet in a significant way. That does it for this episode of Becoming Sister Wives Book Club. Tomorrow, I'll be putting out the next episode of Seeking Sister Wife, and I will try to fit in the next episode of my Sister Wives Rewatch this week as well. Season 2, Episode 11, Sister Wives in the City of Sin. To my YouTube viewers, please like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts on all things Sister Wives down below in the comments section. Thanks so much for tuning in. See you soon. Bye.